results-based payments for REDD+ are in fact payments for high-quality results. It's particularly important in this context we're living in which the science is telling us that forests are 30% of the climate solution, and at the same time only account for 2% of climate-related investment. We'll begin our session today with a brief context-setting presentation from my colleague Donna Lee. After her presentation, we'll bring our group of panelists onto the stage and launch straight into what I hope will be a spirited discussion, bringing in perspectives from subnational governments in Brazil, Mexico, and the US. We'll add to that mix the experience of a major source of public finance for REDD+, representing what I sort of calculated back of the envelope is about $100 per capita per year for this small country that sits on our small planet about as far away from a tropical forest as almost any other country on Earth, where we are today. And then we'll also have a panelist who represents a remarkably effective civil society organization whose very name, Greenpeace, reflects a vision toward which we are all aspiring. We'll save the last 30 minutes for questions from the audience, so please use the app as you've been instructed to submit your questions along the way. They'll show up on an iPad for me, and I'll click them and read them off as we go. Before I turn it over to Donna for her presentation, I wanted to just flag for us to note a few kind of higher-level challenges that I find myself facing whenever I have a conversation about this topic with a diverse audience. The first challenge is that this topic is quite technical in nature, which makes it easy to get lost in the details. I'm hoping that in our discussion today we'll try to balance this need for getting granular with an intent to focus on major issues rather than on minutiae. The second challenge is what is sometimes referred to as the moving goalposts problem. REDD+ transactions can and do include a variety of arrangements. Donna's presentation will illustrate this. This complexity can be troublesome, particularly for developing countries that may have their technical capacities stretched already, only to be asked to adapt to what must seem like an unending evolution of requirements. The third challenge is carbon markets. While we won't be talking only about carbon markets during this session, market approaches will be part of the discussion. Specific objections to market approaches are definitely within the scope of this session, but I prefer to avoid hosting an ideological debate this afternoon. It's not that I don't enjoy ideological debates, but without expressing any preference for one ideology over another, I do have a preference of how we spend the limited time that we have together today, and I don't think ideology is the best use of that. So with those as the sort of three kind of opening things to flag before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Donna to set the context for us.
Thanks, Dan. My experience with Dan is that he enjoys a good debate. So my first COP was COP 13, and as many of you know, I was the U.S. negotiator at that time, and as we were talking about REDD+ and how to provide incentives, including payments for results, I don't think any of us at that time thought the world would look this complex. What we've ended up with in terms of providing countries with these incentives is a range of what Dan just referred to as arrangements. And indeed, the world that we see today, I don't think any of us had envisioned at that time. And so my hypothesis that I'm putting forward to you today is that there are a range of different criteria that countries in some ways are expected to meet in order to access different types of results-based finance. And to me, one of the most important axes on which there are these differences or continuums is this issue of whether or not results are being used in a market context for compliance versus simply a payment for results. And so what we see on the left-hand side of the continuum here are situations where countries are getting paid purely for demonstrating that they have achieved a certain performance. So there is no asset creation, there's no transfer of title, of ownership of a carbon asset. It's almost like a payment for ecosystem service. So that's the case in the Red Early Movers Program, in the Amazon Fund, and now with the Green Climate Fund offering these types of payments for results with no asset. On the other side of the continuum are situations like in California's market, where they have domestic forest credits that actually are creation of this asset that's getting traded and being offset for an emission in, say, a fossil fuel sector. In the middle, we have some hybrids where you have for example, the SPF Carbon Fund that has been created to test, to try out whether or not at jurisdictional scale we can have this type of a market type transaction. And under the fund, you have different tranches. So tranche B are largely donor governments who have said that they want to see the transfer of title, but they will retire it and allow countries to count that emission reduction towards their NDC, for example. Whereas in tranche A, they're interested in actually taking ownership of that unit. So we have these different types of transactions, and because of that, we have different criteria. So I want to talk about 3 different types of criteria just to set the stage. The first are technical criteria, and here we're talking about criteria around how to set baselines, what's the level of acceptable uncertainty, how you manage leakage, permanence. There might be requirements around monitoring or around the type of coverage. In other words, what activities, pools, gases need to be included. The second type of criteria are what I call process criteria or considerations. And here we're talking about how are the emission reductions verified? Who's verifying? What type of accreditation procedure do they need to go through? Do they need to check on conflicts of interest? How are corrective actions managed? Issues around transparency and requirements around public participation. How are credits issued, tracked, monitored? What's that chain of custody? These I consider to be process considerations or criteria. The third and final type of consideration is what I would consider to be policy considerations. So here, it might not have to do with whether or not an emission reduction is real, additional, accurate, but really around issues that market regulators might be concerned about. So one that has been often mentioned with regard to forests is market flooding, because countries can generate a large number of credits, and how will this impact the price and the ability of a country to actually reduce its own emissions. So that's really a policy issue. I also think some of the issues related to the Paris Agreement that now regulators are thinking about around double counting, how ambitious, how does it relate to a country's own NDC. These are issues that are really related to policy. So there are these different types of considerations or criteria, and within different types of arrangements, the criteria can be quite different. So I just have one more slide, and I was just given a few minutes to tee up the conversation. So I just wanted to give a sense of why there are these different criteria for different types of transactions. And this slide is just a really rough approximation of where there might be some differences that we can think about. So here I gave 3 different examples of 3 different transactions. The first is the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund is offering results-based payments. It is based on the UNFCCC process, so it's based on the reference levels and results that are submitted by countries to the UNFCCC, and those get technically assessed and analyzed through the expert review process. That's in the first column. The second is the FCPF Carbon Fund, and as you can recall, this carbon fund, as I mentioned earlier, was a fund that was developed to test out jurisdictional forest carbon crediting to see whether or not there could be, it's a pilot to see whether or not these transactions and under what conditions, and to work in partnership between donor governments largely and developing countries. And then the final is what I would consider compliance markets. So what do I feel market regulators would expect in terms of developing rules and regulations for market-type transactions? So I just picked a few different criteria here, and as an example of where we might see some differences. So, for example, on accuracy and uncertainty, this is one of those technical criteria. Where might there be differences? And currently, under the GCF and FCPF Carbon Fund, there's a little bit more flexibility. So under the GCF, a country can have relatively high uncertainty, but still access funding from the GCF. Under the Carbon Fund, there are deductions. They're a little bit higher than the GCF, but a country can still have over 100% uncertainty, deducting only 15% from the actual value. Whereas in a compliance market, there's typically a much higher expectation of what that level of uncertainty might be. Another example of where there might be a difference would be in completeness. So here you will see, for example, that under the GCF, under the UNFCCC process, countries are really encouraged to include all significant activities, pools, and gases. Whereas in a market, many markets allow for offsets that are in a particular activity, like just avoided deforestation. A country doesn't have to include degradation or reforestation, even if those might be significant, as long as they can show that they have accurate emission reductions in a single activity. And this is because under the UNFCCC, one of the key purposes of that, of the REDD+ concept is to help countries to build their capacity to be able to report in all categories. So what we see, I think, is different criteria because both the purpose and the context is different, as well as the end use of that emission reduction. One more example maybe that I'll provide is on comparability. So if you look at the REDD+ decisions that were agreed by the UNFCCC, so all 190 countries, there was an expectation that what was submitted to the UNFCCC would be transparent, accurate, complete, consistent, but comparability wasn't included in that set of characteristics. But for a market, comparability is one of the most important characteristics because an efficient market requires fungible units. And so for a market, that's one of the most important characteristics. So we would see there it being a really important characteristics for compliance markets. So I think I'll end there. Hopefully this gives some food for thought for why we see different criteria for different REDD+ transactions. Thanks.
Thanks, Donna, for helping to set the frame, the context for our session. So I'd like to invite our panelists to join us on the podium now, and we'll launch into our discussion here. So if you all can come up and take your seats. So I'll just very briefly, you have on the screen the who we've got. I'll just briefly introduce each of them, and then we'll launch into the questions. To Donna's left is Alberto Tavares, who's the president of the Acre Environmental Services Development Company, coming all the way from Brazil to participate with us today. Next to him, we have Ricardo Hernandez, Secretary Ricardo Hernandez, Secretary of Environment for the state of Chiapas in Mexico. Again, thank you for a long trip to be with us. To Ricardo's left is Jason Gray. Jason is with the California Air Resources Board in the climate change program, and is maybe the closest to fulfilling that role of a market regulator that Donna mentioned earlier. And then Andreas Dahl-Jorgensen, Deputy Director of NICFI, and to his left, Esben Marcussen from Greenpeace, with us today, representing Greenpeace, as well as being our civil society representative on this panel with us this afternoon. All right, so the way we're going to conduct this is I'm going to start off a first round where I'll just ask a question to each of our panelists. They know that they've got up to 3 minutes to answer the first question, and they've been forewarned that I can be kind of rude and interrupting and telling them that they're done. So we're going to kind of keep them to that, keep this discussion moving, and then after that we're going to have a less formal kind of exchange for a bit, and as I said, we'll shift in the last half hour to Q&A from the group, from all of you here. So Alberto, we're going to start with you, and just look to you to sort of reflect on Donna's presentation in the context of your experience in the state of Acre in developing the Red Early Movers program there. If you could share with us what that experience was like, and in particular reflect on what for you may have been the more critical or the more challenging of the criteria and considerations that Donna described in her presentation in your activity of developing and implementing the REM program in Acre, which is the first of the REM programs that have been underway.
Obrigado, Dan. Primeiramente, agradecer o convite. São 3 minutos, não é isso? Vou cronometrar aqui. Bom, eu venho do estado do Acre, que é um estado da Amazônia brasileira, onde há quase 20 anos nós trabalhamos um processo de abordagem jurisdicional, ou seja, de uma gestão integrada de paisagem com diversas políticas públicas que são orientadas no sentido de promover o desenvolvimento sustentável do Estado e, ao mesmo tempo, garantir a conservação ambiental das nossas florestas e garantir a questão da justiça social com comunidades florestais, sejam elas indígenas, sejam elas extrativistas, e, obviamente, melhoria da qualidade de vida da população. Em 2010, o Acre aprova o seu sistema de incentivo aos serviços ambientais, onde nós temos 7 programas previstos e iniciamos com a implementação do programa de incentivo aos serviços ambientais de carbono. Importante a gente destacar que no Acre nós não trabalhamos com a perspectiva de pagamento de serviços ambientais, mas são incentivos que, através das políticas públicas, demais políticas públicas existentes, a gente dá suporte à consolidação dessas políticas. Então, surgiu a oportunidade do Acre, pelas suas diversas condições criadas, como ser o primeiro caso de implementação do mecanismo RED for Early Movers. Iniciamos a implementação em 2013 e é óbvio que o desafio foi enorme, porque RED traz toda uma linguagem nova, específica, baseado nos acordos de clima, aonde nós precisamos criar o marco legal, criar o marco de estruturas para trabalhar esse tema. Então, criou-se o Instituto de Mudanças Climáticas, a Companhia de Desenvolvimento de Serviços Ambientais, a qual eu dirijo há 4 anos, e iniciamos, então, esse processo. O que, numa perspectiva inicial, nós sempre olhamos que o RED deve trazer um conjunto, uma mescla, uma mistura ampla de possibilidades de valoração e valorização dos serviços ecossistêmicos. Tivemos a iniciativa com pagamento por resultado, o que é muito importante, mas é importante a gente destacar que talvez o maior desafio é que a gente equacione as expectativas iniciais, que pagamento por resultado, primeiro, não alcançam a escala que nós necessitamos de financiamento para efetivamente consolidar a transição de um modelo business as usual para um modelo de sustentabilidade. Então, a importância de nós termos outros mecanismos compondo um mix de possibilidades é muito importante. O Acre trabalha em diversos mecanismos de financiamento, sejam eles os empréstimos com bancos multilaterais, como o Banco Mundial, o Banco Interamericano, com recursos próprios, com recursos do orçamento nacional. Mas, por exemplo, o Head for Removers representa algo em torno de 5% a 7% do total de investimentos que o Acre fez nesses últimos 8 anos. Então, isso primeiro mostra o desafio que a gente tem. É uma expectativa de que o programa de RED possa contribuir, mas hoje os recursos disponíveis para a implementação da política, elas não são suficientes para que a gente possa efetivamente dar escala. São fundamentais, porque o Acre também teve acesso a recursos do Fundo Amazônia.
Okay, so you said 3, so we've got 30 seconds for the other 2.
Ok. E poderíamos dizer que o arcabouço legal também de RED, do mecanismo, seja para atender salvaguardas socioambientais, etc., fizemos todos os esforços. O Acre tem certificação das salvaguardas socioambientais, adquirida em 2015, mas talvez o maior desafio é hoje a gente pensar quais os mecanismos financeiros inovadores para que a gente possa ampliar essa escala do financiamento. Os recursos foram fundamentais, mas ainda são insuficientes.
Okay, thanks very much, Alberto. Ricardo, a similar question for you. You've been working in the state of Chiapas. Before that, you worked with the CONAFOR, with the federal government, and you've been involved in this development of the carbon fund project of the state of Mexico and the participation of Chiapas in that. Could you share with us your experience and what kinds of considerations, criteria have been most critical for you in developing that program?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Quiero saludar y dar las gracias al gobierno de Noruega, al GCF Task Force por invitarme a esta importante reunión. Y quiero, de manera general, hacer los siguientes comentarios en torno a la construcción del proceso de red en México y, por supuesto, cómo esto se ha ido reflejando en los diferentes estados del gobierno mexicano que participamos en la iniciativa de red. Como bien se ha dicho, ha sido un proceso relativamente largo, un proceso en el cual iniciamos con integrar información para ver las tasas de deforestación que estábamos teniendo en México y en torno a esto empezar a generar estrategias para reducir esta deforestación que principalmente para los estados red que están ubicados en el sureste de México era derivado de las cuestiones agropecuarias, es decir, el cambio de uso del suelo por agricultura y ganadería preferentemente. Empezamos a hacer los análisis de las tasas de deforestación y a la par empezamos a construir un sistema de monitoreo y de reporte para estimar y definir cuál era nuestra línea de base y poder entonces tener consideraciones de hacia dónde empezar a movernos con acciones tempranas en algunos estados y en algunas regiones muy particulares. Iniciamos con todo un proceso de análisis, de consulta, de integración que nos llevó a la definición de la Estrategia Nacional de Cambio Climático. Derivado de la Estrategia de Cambio Climático hicimos la Estrategia Nacional de Red y posteriormente con una metodología que fuimos discutiendo, que fuimos ensamblando, hicimos cada uno de los estados nuestras estrategias estatales. Hoy, en varios de los estados, particularmente en el estado de Chiapas, estamos en el proceso de consulta de nuestra estrategia para que pueda ser publicada, pero estamos teniendo las consideraciones básicamente que son los planteamientos que nos han hecho referente al Fondo Cooperativo de Carbono, al FCPF, y con esto poder ir estableciendo nuestra línea de base, establecer los riesgos de las fugas que pueden existir, estableciendo los mecanismos y los criterios también de salvaguardas y evaluar los impactos que podemos tener en torno a las acciones derivadas de evitar la deforestación. En contexto más general, estamos enfocando no solamente en red para la permanencia de nuestros bosques, sino que estamos pensando en un contexto más avanzado, más allá, que sea un complejo en donde las actividades agropecuarias no promuevan la deforestación, y estamos pensando en un desarrollo rural de bajas emisiones. Sí pensando en el mercado que pudiese venir derivado de acciones de cumplimiento, en el esquema de pago por resultados, pero también en acciones que tengan que ver con la reforma del marco legal político de México, que garanticen invertir los recursos en una forma que nos permita garantizar la permanencia del bosque.
Great, thanks, Ricardo. We'll come back to some of what you mentioned in the next round. So, Jason, you're in an interesting situation in the state of California where you have a functioning market in the state, a domestic market. You have forests domestically as part of that cap and trade system. And now you're at a point where after a number of years, you're further along in considering the potential of including international credits, red credits, as potentially applicable into the cap and trade system. Can you talk a little bit about the criteria set in California already domestically, how that's functioning and how that informs your thinking about the potential of forest internationally becoming part of the California cap and trade system?
Sure, thanks. And Dan, I took your suggestion to be, or your direction to be very concise by writing something very small on a very small piece of paper. So I'll do my best to read my own writing. I think as an operating compliance market, I think a lot of the way that Donna described those comparability, those different technical policy and process requirements, that really is what we had to consider. In developing our offsets program, we really had to look at what scope can we have for offsets. Really, it's designed to have a cost containment element in a market program. It's designed to incentivize reductions in sectors that are not covered by our cap and trade program. We're a regulatory agency. If we could regulate many sectors, we do. But this is designed to incentivize reductions in those sectors we don't directly regulate. And really to get those additional environmental services, those social and environmental benefits that come from those types of activities. For the design of the program, we really looked to what was already out there in terms of the voluntary market, in terms of other standards, and then tried to build on those. We tried to build some of the comparability, some of the verifiability, the certainty levels. So I think ours is you have to be 95% certain to get a comparable instrument in the program. And looking at a performance standard for that particular sector. So in the forest sector, we looked at the years of work developing voluntary carbon offset protocols. We took those through our process, through our policy, our technical, and our political process under three kind of high-level criteria, looking for certainty for market actors and for those that would develop projects and for communities that were involved in projects, the rigor necessary for a market, as well as transparency. So that certainty and that rigor really comes from those technical and policy requirements. The public process of getting a regulation through and building it into law, that really adds to the transparency side of it. All of our documentation is very transparent. We've had very extensive consultation processes. And we require our offsets program to have all the project material and all the program material published online per each project. So I think that was really important for us in a market program. And that certainty really is looking at not just investors, not just compliance entities, but how does a project developer, how does a community really come in? How does a nation, sovereign nation like the tribal governments we've been working with, how do they participate in the program? And I think we've learned a lot and we've been pushed in different ways, which has been good, and I think it's made the program a lot more rigorous. I think the other element to this is, this is a tool among many others, and I think that's important to bear in mind. This is not the be-all, end-all, but for those who it works for, this is an important tool. And just on that, in terms of scope of our program, we've issued about 85 million offset credits for forest projects in 19 states in the United States. This is one of our climate diplomacy pieces. We've been able to engage with many other states in the US, even if some of those states don't have a direct climate program. Of that, taking today's market prices, that's about $800 million in climate finance value. And 60% of those forest projects are on tribal and Alaska Native lands, which I think is a huge success of the program that was really brought to us by indigenous communities and tribal governments in the United States, and I think that's really important to note. Finally, in terms of looking at the international piece, I think we'd be looking at some of these same types of requirements, building on existing standards. We recognize that there's lots of standards out there. Donna's list had a bunch of those. We're not the experts in all the standard development, we're not going to try to reinvent the wheel. We'd be looking at what other existing standards are there, because many jurisdictions like Acre, like Chiapas, who we've worked with for many years, and actually have a very great list of recommendations we'd be considering if we move forward with a standard. So I think that's important to recognize we'd be building off of those, but I'll end there for now.
Great, thanks. It's great to have the experience of a functioning system domestically and the learning that comes with that, and we'll come back to that in the second round. Andreas, so your minister this morning referred to a process of learning over the past decade of NICFI experience, Norwegian government experience in this space. And NICFI has really been a pioneer in red transactions, beginning with the Amazon Fund 10 years ago, which also celebrated its anniversary here. Be interesting for you to reflect, share with us your reflections, since you've been involved since quite early in this, and how that thinking has evolved. What's changed, what's the same in your thinking about these red deals that Norway has moved forward from? Let's start with that, with just a little thinking backwards, thinking forwards from you.
Sure, thanks, Dan, and thanks for putting me between California and Greenpeace. That's a very comfortable place to be. I actually offered Esben to write my talking points, but he didn't deliver, so now I'm just going to say, oh. All right, so, no, I think a lot has changed, and a lot has not changed. I think what has changed the most, and I think our minister described that this morning, is the sort of thinking around the role of red payments to reduce deforestation, and what it is, what we were trying to do 10 years ago, what we're trying to do now. I think the whole beginning of how red was framed initially, from Bali to Copenhagen, the very early discussions was around, a 2-degree world where the countries agree across the table in Copenhagen, and there's a global cap, and rich countries take on ambitious targets, developing countries don't, and then there's a transfer of massive proportions, and reducing deforestation was the cheapest, and then there's $20 billion a year for red. And of course, that didn't happen, and there's that for good and bad, right? So there's a very positive story around that, which is that forest countries are taking on their own goals and taking responsibility for their emissions. The downside is that it's been harder to mobilize large-scale finance. But as the minister also said, there's the assumptions behind that sort of opportunity cost logic, where you compensate the country for doing something that's inherently something they don't want to do. I think is something we've tried to overcome since, and now we're trying to partner with countries that want ambition and that they want to achieve reduced deforestation, both because they want to contribute to the global climate solution, but also because it's good for them and good for development and good for a lot of number of reasons. I think what has stayed the same, and is also something the minister said, what is it that you need to do to reduce deforestation? A lot is about public policy. And public policy, regulations, enforcement, domestic incentives is something you have to do at the political relevant level. So that's a national level or jurisdictional level. I think that's something we understood from the outset, and something that we have stayed consistently strived towards promoting since. And I think the Amazon Fund was kind of I think it was a few days into the initiative where employee number 1 and 2 went to Brazil and learned about the Amazon Fund, and it was kind of the logic that we tried to inspire other countries to take on. And there's, of course, the holistic version of it. It's also the ambition, with the reference level being gradually adjusted downwards. And it is the broad principle of Brazilian ownership of the strategy, but also what you spend the money on towards contributing to that strategy. I think just as a general experiences with results-based payment, I think that from our perspective, that has been something we are really happy we've done, and something we want to do more of. And the reasons are several. One is the country ownership. I mean, it's very hard to tell a country that this is what you need to do to reduce. These are the regulations or enforcement actions that you need to do to reduce deforestation. It will come across as extremely intrusive, but those are the things they need to do to deliver the results. So in effect, it delivers that country ownership around the strategy, and diplomatically, it's the only way it's possible to deal with those drivers of deforestation, and it gives a country the focus of doing the right thing. It's also a domestic reason we do it, and that's sort of a risk reduction for us. We can make a large pledge to a country and not pay that country if they don't deliver, and then we have been bold, but we haven't dispersed and spent the money with no results, so that we know that up front, that if we spend a lot of money, it's because we have a result, and that's a much easier thing to tell our parliament. I think there's
Okay, Andreas, hosting doesn't give you an extension on time.
oh, I didn't see the okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, great. We'll come back to you in a bit. I just want to reemphasize the point. I think Francis Seymour, a number of years, pointed out to me that one of the really core elements of results-based payment is no payment for no results. And you have this experience actually with the Amazon Fund of cutting payments for lack of results that has been part of this learning. So come back to that as well. So Esben, Andreas has sort of teed you up a little bit for your role here. I would say from my own interactions, it's clear Greenpeace itself and more broadly civil society has also approached these transactions, these red arrangements and the criteria for them with a mix of interest sometimes, opposition other times, engagement ranging from watchdog roles to implementation partnerships. So obviously won't ask you to speak for civil society broadly, but for Greenpeace, if you could reflect on what you've heard from the other panelists and your own learning as an organization and what you see as the opportunities and challenges going forward for more effort in this area of results-based payments moving ahead to incentivize deforestation reduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Actually, I recognize a lot of what Andreas was saying. I think from the beginning, 10 years ago, a lot of civil society organizations were sort of split between, just seeing someone take action, seeing something happening. So it's sort of like an activism in establishing REDD+ that was very sort of encouraging and cherished. But also the early rhetoric was pretty blatant on the offset part. And as Andreas was saying, I think it was set up in a time for preparation for an international climate regime where you would have a global cap, and you would pretty easily set up a system, and you would be able to trade carbon, and it would all be done in a principle of cost efficiency. And it perhaps looking back now, it was a pretty naive idea, and some of the rhetoric was also pretty naive. At least in Norway, it was sort of, we know how to not cut down trees. It's cheaper to not cut down trees than reduce emissions at home. It turned out that none of that was really true. And the other thing I think we were critical about from the very beginning, and this is a sort of old argument, but there's this inherent flawed logic in replacing carbon from fossil fuel emissions to carbon that are stored in trees for an uncertain amount of time, a little bit longer. In the first example, you take up carbon from below the ground. It's been there for millions of years. And you immediately release it to the air. And on the second, reducing deforestation, it is already in the biosphere, and you don't know for how long it will stand. So already there, you don't really have a currency that can be changed. And of course, there were other points of criticism, just the power imbalance from northern countries, and sort of imposing policies on southern countries or tropical forest countries. That was just an early sort of reflex, I think, among many civil society organizations. And then, of course, all these issues of uncertainty, permanence, and so on that have evolved. I think a lot of those problems have been acknowledged, And in a way, our criticism was perhaps effective, or just the flawed logic became so apparent that it did not move as fast as perhaps someone had seen 10 years ago.
Okay, we'll come back to more on that, because I think we're at, oh, he's got a minute left? All right.
Right.
You've got a minute left. All
Okay,
right.
so now we see the sort of the debate is sort of re-emerging, and I think organizations like Greenpeace are now willing to re-enter the debate and see where is this is going. We have more frameworks set up. At the same time, just want to point out that beyond the negotiations and the frameworks that have changed, the world has also changed. So we are now in a situation where the global carbon budget is pretty limited. So if we are to reach the 1.5 target, what is really there to trade? So this old argument of we can't change one for the other, we have to do both, I think is still very, very valid. Yeah, I'll stop there. So.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for this first round. We deliberately had this first round a little bit broad, and now I'm going to sort of try to get us to be a bit as specific as we can, and so apologies in advance if I'm sort of pushing any of you to answer questions that you have trouble answering. Feel free to push back and say, I can't answer that question yet, but I want to see how far we can get it. And I'll try to come to each of you in turn, but not necessarily in the same order. So Jason, I'm going to start with you. You've mentioned towards the end of your first response that you've had these ongoing conversations with either the Latin American colleagues sitting to your right around their programs. There's the interest in California and possibly extending this domestic program internationally. From what you've learned about what Ricardo and Alberto are involved in leading in Chiapas and Acre respectively, what would they need to do, what if anything would need to be different, additional, less? What kinds of requirements of things that they're not already doing would California, the California cap and trade system need for? Well, I'll start with Ricardo, since he's right next to you and he's nodding his head, and Alberto's still taking notes. What would each of them in turn maybe need to be thinking about doing that's not already part of their day-to-day to be able to enter into the cap and trade system in California?
Thanks. I'll do my best on that, since we still are trying to figure out a way to really have this in regulation. And I think on a lot of the technical side, we know really what needs to happen. I think that's what the states and the partners have been really working on. I think it's a combination of some of the verification and transparency sides, looking at what really is reported. So I will actually go to Acre first. I think Acre has done an incredible amount, maybe more than anyone, on putting a lot of these standards already in place. I think it'd be really looking at those to see, is it a similar level of transparency? Are the data files, or the program reporting materials, how much is out there? Would there need to be more? I think that's a consideration we'd still need to work through. There's some really technical things like setting up a registry system, and I think there are some of those things that I know Mexico at the federal and state level is working to push further on, and all that is towards some transparency as well. So I don't have a specific thing like, oh, Ricardo, you should be doing this exactly. I think it's really looking at the suite of measures and suite of standards and suite of consultations and engagement that each state or each jurisdiction is undergoing, and figuring out a way to make sure that's rigorous and transparent, and in many cases it is.
Mm-hmm.
Our challenge is, how do we build that into a regulatory framework that's similar enough that we are comfortable that it's as rigorous as our domestic program. And I think technically, I think we've gotten some great recommendations. I think technically that's definitely possible.
Great, thanks. Before I go to Ricardo to respond to that, let me just encourage folks in the audience again to get your questions in through the app, because we'll be shifting over to that shortly. So Ricardo, you've heard Jason's response to my question, so I guess the threshold question for you is, are you interested? And secondly, if you are interested, does what he's talking about seem reasonable, or is it, or not? And how do you think about what might need to happen in Chiapas if it is something that you're interested in pursuing?
Sí, definitivamente, como hemos dicho, el proceso de red es un proceso todavía en construcción, en aprendizaje aún todavía. Desde hace años en la plataforma del GCF Task Force que firmamos un acuerdo entre California, de hecho Acre y el estado de Chiapas para ir analizando el potencial desarrollo de mercados internacionales basados en el carbono. Esto nos dio mucha oportunidad porque derivado de los análisis y de las metodologías internacionales fuimos aplicando de manera más rigurosa el proceso para conocer las implicaciones que esto tenía. Entonces, de manera particular en el estado de Chiapas, en el estado de Jalisco también llevamos un proceso de construcción conjunta con California y a su vez también el gobierno federal a través de la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y la Comisión Nacional Forestal nos estamos reuniendo de manera permanente con California para ir conociendo los esfuerzos y también conocer con una expectativa de mercado hacia adelante. Sabemos que también es una regulación que tiene que hacer el Estado de California y estaremos caminando en el proceso para hacer una construcción conjunta y en determinado momento que se abra la oportunidad de empezar a hacer transacciones económicas basadas en el carbono, lo podamos hacer. Pero es un proceso de construcción. Y por el otro lado, hay que reforzar la idea de que efectivamente la cooperación internacional, los fondos que pueden venir de la cooperación internacional son muy importantes, pero son igualmente importantes los recursos de los gobiernos estatales o de los gobiernos federales. Entonces tenemos que trabajar en dos vías, uno hacia la construcción de los mecanismos para transacciones internacionales, pero también trabajar en el mercado doméstico, por decirlo de alguna forma, reformando los programas, las políticas públicas que nos ayuden a garantizar que los recursos que están llegando a promover de alguna forma el proceso productivo en agricultura, en ganadería o en cambio de uso del suelo, podamos hacerlo bajo estándares de mejores prácticas para garantizar un desarrollo rural con recursos del Estado y esperando también poder tener recursos adicionales, que no es una garantía que puedan llegar y no es una garantía que puedan cubrir el 100% de las necesidades con la inversión estatal o la inversión nacional.
Great, thanks very much for that response, Ricardo. Alberto, ask you the same question as what Jason's described. Are you interested in trying to do something with California in addition to what you're already doing through the REM program, through the Amazon Fund? Is there an opportunity there for you? Is it attractive? If so, is what Jason's mentioned things that you see as feasible, desirable, or not?
Sim, absolutamente. Poderia dizer que esse já é um namoro que já está passando do tempo de acontecer um casamento, mas, enfim, vamos nos alinhando e buscando. E eu acho que, nessa perspectiva, é importante a gente reforçar o que já foi dito no painel, ou seja, em 10 anos, muita coisa mudou. Exatamente foi em 2008, né, quando o Acre torna-se um dos fundadores da Força-Tarefa dos Governadores para a Floresta e Clima, nesse ambiente que, inclusive, é assinado um memorando de entendimentos, e que nós, nesses quase 10 anos, vamos também trabalhando a ampliação de perspectivas. É claro que a perspectiva de um mercado compliance existe de ambas as partes e de muitos outros. É claro que também nesse processo o governo nacional no Brasil também foi definindo com mais clareza os marcos legais. É sabido que o governo brasileiro, de uma maneira em nível nacional, não vem apoiando iniciativas de rede para mercado de compliance, mas, enfim, amplia-se aí também perspectivas de se ver que a cooperação não pode, não deve, talvez, acontecer só na perspectiva de mercado de carbono, mas uma cooperação que pode ser ampliada do ponto de vista de transferência tecnológica, ampliação de mercado para os produtos as quais, inclusive, as cadeias produtivas recebem incentivos e apoios que tornam-se produtos com perfis sustentáveis. Agora, é interessante a gente observar o quão potente essas iniciativas jurisdicionais para oferecer esses créditos. A Califórnia, na sua iniciativa, até aproximadamente 2025, tem uma perspectiva de reduzir algo em torno de 300 milhões de toneladas de CO2. O Acre, nesses 10 anos do seu programa, já reduziu algo em torno de 250 milhões, ou seja, nós estamos falando da sexta economia do mundo, se fosse um país, e nós estamos falando de um estado que é 700 vezes menor do ponto de vista de PIB e que tem um potencial de redução semelhante. Então, nós não podemos desconsiderar que a equação de solução para a conservação de floresta e desenvolvimento não passa por essa diversidade de mecanismos. E eu acho interessante a gente ouvir do Greenpeace justamente que muita coisa mudou, ou seja, é importante a gente observar que precisamos ter todos os mecanismos juntos, e é essa perspectiva que nos coloca nesse ambiente de uma coalizão global, por exemplo, na força-tarefa do GCF, pensando várias jurisdições, fazendo a abordagem do RED jurisdicional para a gente ir além dessa abordagem pontual que projetos de RED trazem, e a gente endereça, e a gente cria salvaguardas de uma série de questionamentos que tradicionalmente o RED sofria, né? Quando se traz essa abordagem para um nível mais de gestão de escala de paisagem. Então, a gente sim está pronto e acho que precisamos fazer, porque quem sabe faz a hora, não espera acontecer. A gente precisa avançar.
Thanks for that. I think one of the messages coming through very clearly is that RED Plus payments can be very helpful as part of a portfolio, but if there was ever a belief going back up to a decade ago that this was a silver bullet to address this huge global challenge we have, we've learned that that's not true, and that it is, in a sense, a kind of an all-of-the-above set of approaches that are needed to address the problems that we're faced with. Before I go back to Andreas and Esben, Donna, I wanted to ask you to kind of clarify two things for us. One, coming out of a comment from Esben about the comparability between fossil fuel emissions and emissions associated with deforestation. No, you've been involved in thinking about this question about the issues of relative permanence and the challenges around permanence of forest emission reductions. So maybe some just sort of more technical clarification around that. And then as we're hearing the discussion from California, Mexico, Chiapas, and Acre, it strikes me that there's a lurking question that would just be good for you to clarify on that comes under this heading of double counting, right? So we've got entities at subnational level already engaged with certain arrangements, interested in engaging with other arrangements. How do you, what are the ways for managing to ensure that there isn't double counting of the same emission reduction? So those two technical questions I'll turn to you to address briefly.
Two very big technical questions. Maybe first of all, one thing I want to say that maybe in response to Esben, that I completely agree, is that our carbon budget doesn't really allow us to operate in, we're in a very narrow space here in order to prevent dangerous climate change. And so I think we really have to be mindful of that. I consider that part of the policy questions, I think. But maybe to your point on permanence, I guess my feeling is that forests and the carbon stock stored in them have been sort of on this planet for millennia, in the same way that fossil fuels have been in geological deposits maybe for the same amount of time. So for me, avoiding an emission, whether it's a fossil fuel or whether it's, in particular, a land use change, are really not that different. You're avoiding an emission. And where we have variability, let's say, in carbon stocks, they grow back. So when you have natural disturbances, the average carbon stock over time doesn't necessarily change. And so to me, a human-induced change in land use isn't that different than a human-induced change in the fossil fuel sector. So maybe I would push back a little bit that we have a permanence issue. Where I do agree we do have a permanence issue is where we give crediting for removals. So when we credit removals, which I differentiate from crediting avoided emissions, which to me are the same, there I think there have been mechanisms that have been designed through buffers, insurance, ways in which you can manage ensuring that you're not crediting something that eventually is taken away. And I think that those mechanisms that have been used in the voluntary carbon market around buffers have actually proven to be quite effective in ensuring that those are real, permanent. And I think California in particular has some really stringent rules around monitoring for 100 years past the last crediting period that really sort of ensure this long-term carbon stock. Your other question was around
Double counting.
double counting. This is a difficult one. I think what I like to do is think about, we want to keep systems whole, and we want to keep integrity of the global system of the Paris Agreement whole. And in that regard, it's important that double counting doesn't occur in that international system. So any credit should only be counted by a single country, whether it's the US or Mexico or the US or Brazil. Now, what happens below that system, what happens in California, only matters for double counting if the US federal government decides to take credit for what California is doing and the credits that you're buying. And in this instance, at least when I worked for the State Department, federal policy hadn't gotten around to making those determinations. So for me, if California, a utility in California, bought a credit from Acre or Chiapas, as long as the US federal government doesn't double count it in its system, I think that we have to be mindful that those are separate systems. And so you can have these transactions occurring, and it's not really a double counting in the same system. So I would just make that distinction.
Okay, thanks, Donna, for that clarification. Andreas, I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit with you, and we had your first response was kind of looking backwards up to where we are now. At the same time, I know, because you and I have been involved in a lot of conversations about this new context that we're in with respect to red transactions. Donna had up on the right side of that first slide the ICAO market system. We have Article 6, particularly 6.2 under the UNFCCC. And what these things and others that are emerging mean in terms of what future red transactions may need to avoid on the one hand and promote on the other. And so I wonder if you could describe some of your thinking on that topic, give us a kind of a preview of what's next, particularly in terms of the evolution of NICFI's priorities and what the needs are out there for moving forward in this space. Noting particularly, as we were asked to do this morning, that this is an urgent issue, right? We're dealing with urgent priorities, and so really what's next on the horizon that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, first of all, we have kind of a luxury of a long planning horizon with our own funds, and I think we have all parties in our parliament agreeing to continue NICFI through 2030 with aid money, not for offsets, but it's basically continuing the way we do. And so that gives us we have to kind of think, how do we do results-based? If we still think that we need to do results-based payments, how do we want to use that money to the most effect and most environmental impact in the world? But then there's also the additional context that you mentioned on for example, ICAO, where there is an ongoing discussion around what should be in and what should be out. And I think there's a concern that we have is that across sectors and within sectors, there's a risk that unless you set up something that's robust, then that won't deliver what you want. And so, for example, to Esben's point too, I think there are bad tons in other sectors that I think have low environmental integrity, and they're very high in environmental integrity red tons. And I think if we can make create the systems that will allow for that high integrity ton to be recognized, then we would be in favor of including it in such a system, which is now happening, right? And will happen anyways. So I think there are a couple of things that would be needed to ensure that, right? So I think we have, it's interesting going back to one of Donna's slides. I mean, I think there's there was a lot of technical categories that compared these different funds, but none of them dealt with the reference level and the ambition level. And so there's the technical analysis, or environmental integrity tends to deal with how you measure a ton, but not whether what you measure against is actually something you want to pay towards, and if it's ambitious. So what we've been thinking around this is, and that we discussed with several partners, is whether we can set up sort of a voluntary structure for forest countries that want to put forward a jurisdictional or national program that can be assessed against all those types of criteria. And so that would be, I think, we need to have to meet those those green dots on the right, I suppose, right? So it needs to be independent verification. It should be not the sort of buyer and seller deciding on what's the acceptable ambition level or social and environmental aspects. So you need sort of a structure to assess and then give an opportunity for those forest countries that want to get that stamp of approval. We're very early in the thinking of how that could look, so that's something we will discuss with you and others in the coming months. Yep.
Great, thanks. Esben, I've saved you for last again in the second round, just to give you a chance to reflect on what you've heard from others in this group. Where do in thinking about the issues that we've been talking about here, the challenges of advancing quickly, the challenges that countries and subnational jurisdictions are facing, the emergence of this set of different kinds of transactions and opportunities. From a Greenpeace perspective, what are you trying to promote in this space? There's a lot of interest in really bringing more finance into the support for reducing deforestation. What are you trying to kind of promote, and what are you trying to sort of see if Greenpeace, other parts of civil society can help to steer away from?
Well, first, I think what I observe is that there are these fundamental sort of challenges that are built in any transaction system are met with additional layers of complexity, and the evolvement of this or the development of this is moving forward pretty slowly. And I think as Ricardo said, we're building a system. California has been looking at it for many, many years. At the same time, I think also private sector and business are, more and more quickly adapting, and then they are seeing that they need to invest in their own business model if they are to meet a sustainable world, basically. So I'm wondering if this whole idea that is coming from the origins of REDD+ is sort of fading a little bit by its own. If the potential that we're sort of dreaming of, that there's potential to tap into private funding, is a bit exaggerated. That's one observation, and if that is the case, I would say trying to build all these systems and trying to set this in place, incremental steps and building blocks that we were warned against going into by Per Faro last night, that all this could be a distraction. Basically, so we're putting too much effort into building, setting up these mechanisms, and the outcome is perhaps exaggerated. So that would be a warning, I think, from Greenpeace in that sense, that okay, maybe we should just give up on this idea and trying to design programs that work, use public funding, pay for performance programs is already complex enough. So we should just put our effort into that.
Okay, well, thanks. So what I'm hearing there is that remaining and sort of growing concerns about the extent to which the private sector market side of this is may actually turn out to be helpful, or is it really going down the wrong path to pursue it? And I think that's going to remain a question as developments emerge, even as further testing of that develops. I'm going to switch over now to see if I can operate from some questions here coming from the audience. We've got a little less than half an hour left in our session here. I'm going to actually start with a question that is very much picks up on that last point. Now let's see if I can get it to show on screen. Is that going to work? Yes, it does work. So the question, I've been told I have to read out the questions for translation and for the streaming. The question to the panel is, how do you envision the participation of the private sector in jurisdictional or national REDD+? One or two of you want to take that question?
Maybe I'll just give a quick reaction.
Sure, Donna.
Because I found something really interesting that
Esben.
Okay, sorry. Mentioned, which is questioning what is the private sector role and how big can that be. And I was really struck by something you said, Jason, which is that California has generated, 800 million? How much was that?
800 million for forests.
800 million for forests. And I think how much the U.S. government has on an annual basis as a federal government. California is just a piece, one of 50 states. It's a large one, albeit. But that's about on the same order of magnitude that you've been able to generate for forests that the U.S. government. And I think you're the, 10th largest economy, or you're fifth now. Wow. Okay, well, if, the 10 largest economies, which are give or take around the size of California, were to generate that much per, the same amount, that gets actually pretty interesting. So maybe just to say that I was really struck that the private sector can actually generate some interesting figures.
Great. Others want to respond to that? I'm going to go to Andreas. Jason, I've got another question coming to you. Okay.
Well, so I think the main role the private sector plays is in the real economy in the jurisdiction, and driving an economy from a high deforestation economy to a low deforestation economy. And then that's why, this is not all we do, right? So this is not a distraction in the sense that we only set up these mechanisms. We work with the private sector around the world to reduce emissions from supply chains, and to find business models that can benefit the economy without deforesting. And of course, on the buyer side, right? So that's kind of what you alluded to, that the demand will not be there. Well, let's see. I think ICAO could be one. Of course, that there's a lot of levers that they also want to pursue in terms of energy efficiency and efficient flights and aircrafts and all that they need to do anyways. That's better for them, reduces their cost. But they will be residual. So I'd rather that go to high integrity red jurisdictions than, I don't want to name and shame sectors, but there's certainly carbon projects out there that have less integrity. And then I think there's already a voluntary market. I'd rather see that voluntary market demand go to jurisdictional national level red than red projects that frankly often are a distraction from our efforts rather than contributing. I'm not saying they're not good projects out there, but in what we're trying to get countries to do, I think that would be useful to shift that demand to jurisdictional national level. We've talked to a number of companies that said we would be interested, and large companies that could have a sizable demand said, but where do we put the money? Like what's the vehicle? Mm-hmm. We get your point about leakage. We understand that national level, jurisdictional level is the way to go, but where do I do that?
Right.
And so there is I think demand out there. It will not be a silver bullet. We don't think this will be the one solution to reducing deforestation, but it could contribute at the margin on top of countries' own efforts and the private sector and efforts and all that other stuff.
Great, thanks. I promised next question to Jason, and now I'm just trying to see if oh, here it is. Okay. Show on screen. Is it showing on the screen?
For me.
Jason, how likely is it, and when do you expect international red to be allowed into the California market?
That's a good question. I can't really handicap that. I mean, I think we've been working on this for some of the reasons that Andreas raised for quite some time, including with our partner jurisdictions. And I think, I'm going to answer the other question as well, sorry. I think folks are really looking for certainty here, and there's a huge climate finance gap that the public sector has not met, not even close. The California program is, I mean, we've generated a lot of value for folks, and it's being used to incredible purposes. Javier Kinney here from the Yurok tribe, these guys are a model. I mean, the leveraging they've done with financing for climate and cultural issues, I mean, it's incredible. And that's the benefit I think we're all hoping that these types of investments get to. California's market overall is small, so we're not the silver bullet either. But coming up with a standard, maybe a regulatory standard that folks could then use for certainty on whatever investments they're looking at jurisdiction scale. I have heard a lot of interest from institutional investors, from jurisdictions, from indigenous governments, from many, many people saying we'd like to see a standard that's usable but very rigorous, ICAO, for example. So I'm really optimistic that we can come forward with the technical and policy and legal side to use our program, or to insert in our program this type of standard. The challenge in California continues to be on the political side of where those reductions are occurring. So there's been definitely a heavy focus in the last several years. We have new legislation that further reduces the already limited number of offsets we can bring in. And rightly so, we have to address the pollution that's coming from our industry in California, and we are. So that political context in California it's just made the conversation, I think, more robust. I think, to Esben's point, made some of these standards setting and some of the technical aspects more rigorous, and I think we welcome that. So we are at the staff level, and I'll speak now for the staff level at my agency, really still pushing for having some kind of regulatory approach. We have a rulemaking that's going on this year that will be starting later, but it is still not a guarantee. So we're hoping to push it forward, and we'll see.
So I'm going to summarize that as likely, I hope so, and also I expect, if my hope is right, that it won't be too long. Okay, thank you for that, Jason. I have a corresponding question here for Alberto, whose friends know him as Dande. It asks, do you believe the Brazilian federal government will allow credits from Acre to be used in the California market?
Bom, eu gostaria de ter uma bola de cristal, mas definitivamente, assim como na Califórnia, o principal desafio é de ordem política, ou seja, e é importante que seja, porque é importante que, uma vez tomada a decisão, se tenha a consistência necessária para que existam os marcos regulatórios sólidos. Então, do ponto de vista também político, como é conhecido, o Brasil hoje passa por uma situação política muito sensível, mas acredita-se que a partir de 2019 se tenha um novo cenário. Eu acho que o debate no Brasil, sobretudo com o tema da questão do CURCIA, do ICAO, eu acho que a gente pôde amadurecer bastante, a gente pôde perceber que uma série de questões que são levantadas como fragilidades para um eventual transações de rede mercado regulado, elas são superáveis. Eu acho que a gente teve isso, inclusive, no âmbito do Fórum Brasileiro de Mudanças Climáticas. Alguns presentes aqui puderam acompanhar. Eu acho que também o marco regulatório de rede avançou bastante com a Comissão Nacional de Rede, onde se definiu também a questão do Pacto Federativo, ou seja, o que são as compensações que estão atribuídas para o uso do governo nacional e para as jurisdições subnacionais. Mas eu acho que a grande questão que está posta vai além de conjuntura política hoje no Brasil. A questão é, a Amazônia brasileira, que responde pela maior parte das reduções de emissões do Brasil, hoje representa 60% do território, mas o seu PIB é de apenas 8%. Então, a gente precisa entender a importância desse mecanismo entrar nessa cesta de variáveis para se reposicionar a Amazônia do ponto de vista do cenário econômico, obviamente com as questões sociais e ambientais associadas. Aí eu acho que não é uma questão só de conjuntura política, é uma questão de estratégia nacional.
So I'm going to summarize the response somewhat similarly, that it is, so they should, and I hope they will, and there's a lot of good reasons for it. Okay, great. So sorry we don't have more definitive answers to those questions, but I think we've pushed the edge of the crystal ball abilities of our panelists here. A question, I'm going to direct this question, Alberto, to you, since you're in the process of working with Chiapas and the relation with the federal government on a FCPF carbon fund deal. The question is a $5 per ton price for bilateral and carbon fund deals capable of making quick changes, which I interpret to mean is the per ton price significant enough to actually help to affect, to reward and help affect continued positive behaviors to further reduce emissions on the ground?
Ricardo, ¿verdad? Para mí.
Ricardo. Yes, Ricardo.
Gracias. Cuando empezamos en México a hacer la construcción del proceso de red, empezamos a conocer las diferentes oportunidades de mercado y las diferentes opciones que se tenían en precios del carbono. Se establecieron expectativas relativamente altas, ¿no?, ante una posible negociación en la cual se pudiera establecer un precio comparativo a los desafíos que teníamos en México. Y a lo mejor la expectativa que nosotros pusimos en ese contexto fue relativamente alta. Cuando se hace la propuesta sobre $5 la tonelada de carbono, nos parece, para los desafíos que mencionaba y todos los indicadores y los estándares que se han mencionado allá, el nivel del cumplimiento, el nivel de compromiso, cuando se hace este análisis parece relativamente bajo el precio. Esa fue nuestra apreciación. Sin embargo, como lo consideramos en México, es una gran oportunidad que esto tiene, no solamente para tener la expectativa de una transacción comercial con un precio mucho más alto, sino la expectativa que tiene para poder movilizar las políticas públicas, los impactos que nosotros podemos generar a través de la inversión misma de el financiamiento público en nuestros estados y en el país. Con esto garantizar que una gran parte de los recursos que se destinan de alguna forma, por decirle, para cambio de uso del suelo, aunque siempre la filosofía es actividades productivas, aunque terminan generando cambio de uso del suelo, que estas prácticas empiecen a incorporar mejores prácticas ambientales, sociales y culturales, ¿verdad? Y que estén basadas en un esquema de bajas emisiones de carbono. Estoy pensando en la silvicultura, estoy pensando en la ganadería, estoy pensando en cuestiones productivas que garanticen que podamos movilizar recursos importantes del gobierno federal y del estatal para reducir y evitar la deforestación. Entonces, en términos reales, nos parece un precio bajo, aunque la expectativa es muy alta, pero esto puede ayudar a generar políticas públicas sólidas, que busquemos algunas otras alternativas de mercado en el futuro. Hoy el Fondo Cooperativo de Carbono, la negociación que se tiene con el Banco Mundial, parece ser un mercado relativamente importante, pero limitado, y entonces el proceso de construcción de red podría en el futuro esperemos no muy lejano, como lo decía Jason, quizá, tal vez, a lo mejor, ¿verdad?, pero poder generar algunas otras expectativas con mercados, no solamente con los mercados un poco más regulados, sino pensar en otro tipo de mercados.
All right, thanks very much for that. So the short version of that, I would say, is it's a start. It's not where we want to end up. Could be better. And again, it's part of a larger set of incentives. By itself, it's much less than it is together with other incentives. Next question is for Andreas. Do you think a REDD Plus transaction will take place endorsed by the UNFCCC in due course? If so, which country is almost ready to comply with the transaction requirements?
So I'm not sure I understand it entirely, but
I'm going to interpret this to mean under Article 6.
I mean, I think we agreed already, like 8 years ago, that REDD transactions are promoted because we have a framework that has 3 phases, with phase 3 being results-based payments, and results is defined as a ton of CO2 relative to a baseline. So there is already a structure there. But if you talk about sort of countries using REDD to meet their goals and trade it between each other or in markets, I think the Paris Agreement doesn't separate between sectors. So I think it's up to the countries, and I guess that's the determination that every country will have to do, whether they want to have a Article 6 partnership with others or with the private sector or not. I'm not a market negotiator, so I hope I didn't say anything wrong now.
Okay. I'm going to summarize that as I'm not going to answer that question. Okay, next question.
You write these questions yourself?
No, I don't. We have a good audience here. Okay. The next question, Donna, I'm going to ask you to address. It's really asking about criteria that are not the non-carbon criteria. So you've described this sets of, earlier in your presentation, different kinds of considerations and criteria. Could you say a word about the criteria on social and environmental safeguards with respect to the different, I'd add with respect to the sort of different systems that you described? How are those incorporated in ways that are either similar or different categorically from the ones that you focused on?
Yeah, so I will say that my presentation probably should have included these. I sort of focused on the carbon accounting elements. I was thinking about things like gender balance as I was sitting on this panel, and other types of important issues to land use and forests that should be part of the equation. And I imagine that this is something that Jason has thought a lot about as you're thinking about regulations for California. I think the Cancun safeguards are really important, and they should definitely be part of thinking about any market-type transactions, and that's what we've been talking about, that the markets should really ensure that they do no harm, first and foremost, and that has always been part of the discussion on REDD. And so now I'm feeling a little bit remiss in not including that in my presentation, but certainly an important piece.
Okay, great. So we have just a few minutes left here. I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share a closing thought on the subjects we've been describing, talking about here today. And I'm going to go in a bit in reverse order. So Esben, I'm going to start with you. We'll give each of you, I guess I can give each of you a minute if I really hold you to it, to just share either the final thought you want or something that you take away from this conversation that you'd like the rest of us to reflect on. Esben.
I think, well, first, I think it's interesting that this debate is sort of re-emerging after the Warsaw Framework, and we're trying to discuss the Paris Agreement and Article 6, and sort of, so I foresee that this is a debate that will continue to take some time before any sort of robust systems are in place. So I think a final point is just again to remind everyone that the global carbon budget is shrinking almost, by the day. So of course it's true that this is not a silver bullet. It's not meant to be a silver bullet. But for example, when Jason said that $800 million is generated from the private sector, and this can be allocated for forest projects. That's great, I think the inherent skepticism in NGOs and in Greenpeace is like, to what extent can you be certain that those $800 million are used to compensate for the emissions that generated that funding? And that's, I understand I'm not a technical expert in this, and there are a lot of layers of mechanism and so on that is in place to ensure this. But that inherent skepticism, I think, will remain among many NGOs and including Greenpeace. And we will always assume the watchdog role in these processes. So if it's not working, we will at some point find out.
Very good. Well, the world, as well as everyone on the stage audience, counts on you to continue to do that, especially Andreas. So Andreas, you're...
No, but I think that's right. We want that because we want to be able to distinguish between what has integrity and what doesn't. And I think the only, if we set up something new or if we promote red in markets or Article 6 or ICAO, we want to do it only if it makes sense and if it has integrity. I fully take your point on the carbon budget, and that goes for every sector, and the forest numbers coming out are scary. We need to ramp down deforestation very quickly, and that also goes for any transaction and payment for REDD. We actually need to work with countries to ratchet down the reference level too, if we do this. That it has to go towards a zero deforestation future and beyond, right? We need to actually have, restore an area the size of India. So we are in a tough spot as a global climate community, and I think given the right frameworks of ambition and technical safeguards and all that, we think this is worth doing, not the least because we can improve what's already happening. But it is within those limitations that we need to work towards. Yeah.
Jason?
Yeah, I think that all those points are really well taken. I think we cannot solve the climate problem without tackling fossil emissions and emissions from forests and other land use changes. I think we have to do all, and I think we all know that. I think the role that the California government or the California program has been playing, and on this specific piece, we don't have a sovereign wealth fund. We're not a nation. We do have some revenue coming from our auctions and other sources, but we're not able to use those for these types of programs. Our program is small for financing, but we do have an ability, potentially, I hope, to set a standard that can be used by others. We know what needs to be done for the standard. I think that we know how to combine these different things. There's a lot of experience there. So I think that's possible. And I think we will be watched. I think the transparency that we're trying to achieve is being pushed and improved by the watchdogs, and I think that is exactly what has to happen. So I think we're all very happy that the Greenpeace and others are pushing on this. I will just conclude on the safeguards piece. I mean, none of this happens unless those are there. And the safeguards for us, and I think for everyone through the GCF that we're working with, is that's got to benefit the folks that are on the ground. They have to be engaged in the design and the benefit sharing. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. So we would not be looking to partner with any program or anybody if that wasn't really the goal. And luckily, the GCF is really pushing on that. The government.
Great.
So thanks.
Thanks. Ricardo, 1 minute.
Gracias. Tenemos nada más un minuto. Yo soy biólogo y quiero pensar ahora como biólogo. El proceso de red tiene que estar inserto dentro de un proceso del ecosistema, donde estamos todos, donde jugamos un rol todos y donde tenemos que tomar decisiones todos para salvaguardar la integridad del ecosistema. Estamos los que tomamos decisiones desde el punto de vista político, los que somos o los que están haciendo inversiones, los que están jugando el rol de permanencia y conservación, están las comunidades indígenas, los grupos, la visión de género, todos estamos relacionados en este sistema y por lo tanto debemos de construir un sistema lo suficientemente robusto donde nos veamos reflejados todos y podamos garantizar la integridad del ecosistema, que garantice la permanencia de los bosques, la permanencia de las selvas y por supuesto todos los habitantes, los organismos que habitan en el ecosistema. Lo mejor que podemos hacer es tener una base científica lo suficientemente sólida, un consenso políticamente aceptado y una socialización en donde garanticemos gobernanza sobre el proceso de construcción y el proceso de permanencia de nuestros bosques. Creo que solo así lo vamos a lograr.
I can't let you steal from Alberto's minute.
Bom, rapidamente, primeiro, é muito importante a gente considerar que o mecanismo de pagamento por resultado, é importante que ele chegue nas jurisdições nacionais, mas a exemplo do Red Fur Movers, fundamental que ele chegue nas jurisdições subnacionais, onde efetivamente as mudanças de uso da terra acontecem. Então, é importante que se tenha esses diversos layers, nacional, subnacional, local, para que a gente possa alcançar. Segundo, setor privado precisa entrar na equação com mais robustez, mas já existem iniciativas. É fundamental que a gente considere, porque senão a gente vai ficar dependente de uma lógica que não vai dar conta da escala da demanda. E o último $5 não é suficiente para cobrir os custos, mas é o que nós temos. Então, trabalhemos com o que nós temos para que a gente alcance o sonho do futuro.
Okay, I'm told we have to wrap up here. I want to thank all of our panelists, not only, and all of you for participating, not only for our panelists' participation here, but for the leadership that they represent. My last thought is that we need more of them, that the world needs more of them, that we have real leaders in this space on this panel, and what we all ought to try to do is find ways that we can replicate the work that they're doing in other places in the world that we all sorely need. Thank you so much.